It was a quiet September afternoon when the envelope arrived. The sun was starting to dip, casting a soft, amber light through my kitchen window in Ottawa. Autumn had begun its quiet reign, and everything seemed calm, unassuming. Yet, as I saw that cream-colored envelope sitting innocently on the kitchen table, my heart skipped a beat. The handwriting on the front, neat and deliberate, was unmistakably Ethan's no return address, just his name, and the scrawl I knew all too well. My son, the boy I had raised with everything I had. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. For a fleeting moment, I dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something. It could be an invitation. I thought an invitation to his wedding, or maybe even a simple note from him. After all, it had been months since we'd spoken, and the silence between us had stretched further than I'd ever expected. I always kept a small spark of hope, though, a hope that one day, the walls that had grown between us might finally come down, that one day he might reach out, recognize me not just as the provider, but as his father, the man who had worked tirelessly to ensure his future. But no, this wasn't that moment. I tore open the envelope with trembling hands. I couldn't say why I was nervous. Perhaps it was because this was the first time in months I'd heard from him. Or maybe it was the possibility that I could be stepping into a new chapter of our relationship, a chapter where we finally spoke again, heart to heart. But what I found inside wasn't what I'd imagined. There it was, a bill, an itemized invoice, carefully printed, almost too formal. Ibemeyon. Ling ling ling. Ibemeyon. Ling ling ling. The numbers seemed to blur before my eyes as I tried to process what I was seeing. My head spun. At first, I thought I might be reading it wrong. Maybe this was a mistake, some sort of prank. But no. As I read each line, the details became clear, almost mocking in their precision times. $50. 000. Venue the Grand Chateau. Montreal. Archewumeyen. Nul. Catering a gourmet experience for 200 helsersgæsts. Schwumeyen. 000. Photography and videography professional coverage of the entire event. Wumeyen. 000. Live band A jazz ensemble. For the reception, and at the very bottom, a handwritten note in the same precise handwriting I'd seen 1,000 times before. Dad, after everything that's happened between us, I'm letting you contribute. This is your share of the costs. Please send the check by the end of the month. Sophia and I are counting on it. I read those words again, and again. The room felt smaller now. The kitchen, once filled with the sounds of Rachel and Ethan, seemed like a distant memory. How could this be? How had we gone from the laughter-filled evenings to this, an invoice, a demand for money, and nothing more? It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a simple note. It wasn't even a thank you. This was the reality of what my son had become, a man who saw me not as his father, but as a resource to be tapped into. A strange calm washed over me. At first, anger, but I pushed it down. It wasn't the anger that mattered here. It was the realization. I stared at the bill again, each line item standing out like a glaring reminder of everything I had done for him. I raised him alone after Rachel died. I worked double shifts to keep us afloat. I sacrificed every personal moment to ensure he had what he needed. I was there for every milestone, every heartbreak, every triumph. Yet here he was, treating me like nothing more than an ATM. As I sat there, A quiet flood of memories swept over me. I thought about the first time I held Ethan in my arms. He was so small, so fragile, and I promised myself I would do whatever it took to give him the life he deserved. I worked endless hours at the factory, sacrificing vacations, personal time, everything I had, so that Ethan could have more opportunities than I ever had. I pushed aside my grief when Rachel died, never letting Ethan see my pain. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. It was about making sure he had the life I couldn't provide for myself. I put him through college, bought his first car, celebrated every achievement. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The countless hours of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the financial struggles, all of it had been forgotten. All he saw was that I wasn't wealthy enough. I wasn't powerful enough. I wasn't enough. A tightness built in my chest. How had we gotten here? Where did I go wrong? I had been there for him every step of the way. But somehow, it wasn't enough. I had given him everything: my time, my energy, my love. But in return, I received a bill. And the worst part, I wasn't even invited to the wedding. How had he forgotten what truly mattered? How had he become this person, someone who could see me only as a source of money? Was this really the child I had raised? I looked back down at the bill, the numbers almost dancing before my eyes, taunting me. It was at that moment that I realized something. This wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the wedding. This was about Ethan's inability to see me for who I truly was. His father, a man who had given everything for him, and yet was treated as nothing more than a tool to be used when convenient. For a moment, I felt the sting of betrayal, deep and sharp. But then, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about what Ethan had done to me. It was about him. It was about how far he had fallen, how distant he had become from the boy who once admired me, the boy who once saw me as his protector, his guide, his father. I knew I had to take a step back. I couldn't let this consume me, but I couldn't let it go. Either it was time to act not out of anger, but out of a need to show him that actions have consequences. I wasn't going to be treated this way any longer. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the kitchen sink. The cool water splashed against my face, trying to wash away the bitterness, the hurt, but nothing would wash away the reality I had just faced. I was no longer just the provider. I was no longer someone who could be taken for granted. Ethan had forgotten what mattered. He had forgotten the sacrifices I had made. And it was time he learned that there were consequences to living in a world of assumptions, entitlement, and self-interest. I sat back down at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the edges of the bill, and made a decision. I wasn't going to act out of anger. No, this was going to be different. I was going to make him see what he had done. I would do it in a way that didn't destroy him, but made him understand. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The plan was simple. I would let him face the consequences of his actions. I wouldn't give in to his demands. I wouldn't be his fallback any longer. And this time, he would understand that love isn't a transaction, and respect isn't something that can be bought. As the day went on, my resolve grew stronger. I would not let him manipulate me any longer. And maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment he finally saw the truth. Tomorrow would be the first step. It wasn't the first time I had felt the weight of disappointment. But this felt different. After reading Ethan's bill, after realizing the depths to which our relationship had sunk, I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, my fingers still trembling from holding that crumpled note. The anger from earlier had subsided, replaced by something far colder, a sense of finality, a realization that the child I had raised, the boy I had loved with all my heart, was now a stranger to me. It wasn't just about the wedding or the money. It was about everything that had come before, the sacrifices, the countless hours I had poured into raising him. And in return, I received this. The thoughts circled in my mind like a whirlwind. How had we gotten here? How had we gone from the boy who clung to me for comfort, who looked up at me with admiration and trust, to the man who saw me as nothing more than an object to be used when convenient? I couldn't answer that yet. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't about one isolated incident. It was about years of small moments that had built up over time. Things I had missed. Things I had failed to see. I closed my eyes for a moment. And as I did, memories of Ethan as a child flooded back to me. I thought of the nights we spent together, just the two of us. When Rachel passed away, the way Ethan used to hold my hand during those long, sleepless nights, the way he looked to me for reassurance. I had always believed that no matter what, we would make it through anything together. We had, after all, been through the worst of times. But now, it felt like all that effort had been erased. I couldn't help but wonder where I went wrong. I had tried so hard to be both mother and father to him after Rachel died. I worked long hours, often 2 jobs, just to make sure he had the best life I could give him. But in doing so, had I neglected the emotional side of fatherhood, had I focused so much on providing for him that I failed to teach him the values that truly mattered, had I missed the signs when he started pulling away, when he stopped needing me the way he once had, as I sat there, thinking about the past, about all the years of sacrifice and hard work, I began to piece together the events that had led us here. There was the first job I took after Rachel's death, working long hours just to keep us afloat. There was the college tuition I paid for, without hesitation. The first car I bought him when he was old enough. And the endless support I gave him when he struggled with his career choices. All of that effort, all of that love. And yet here I was, holding a bill from him. A demand for money without any acknowledgement of everything I had done for him. I realized then that it wasn't just the wedding that had driven a wedge between us. It was the years of unspoken resentment that had slowly festered beneath the surface. He had grown up in a world of expectations I hadn't been able to meet, no matter how hard I tried. And now, that resentment had boiled over into something I couldn't ignore. The moment I read that bill, I saw it clearly. Ethan had never really understood the sacrifices I had made for him. He had never truly appreciated the love I had given him, the countless hours of hard work, the quiet moments of care and attention I had offered. All of that had been lost in the shuffle of his own ambitions. His desire for success, for status, for validation. And now, he was asking for money, as though my role in his life had been nothing more than to provide for him financially. No, it wasn't just a bill. It was a statement that, despite everything, he had never fully seen me. The more I thought about it, the more it hurt. I had always prided myself on being a good father, on doing everything I could to provide for him, to support him, to help him achieve his dreams. But in the end, what had it all been for? What had I really achieved? If this was how he saw me now, as the hours passed, I knew I couldn't just sit here, brooding over what had happened. I needed to take action. I needed to take control of the situation, to reclaim some dignity. I had given everything for Ethan, and yet I had been treated as an afterthought. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about my own sense of worth, my own sense of self-respect. I thought back to the years when Ethan was young, to the moments when we had laughed together, when he looked to me for guidance, when he saw me as his hero. It was in those moments that I knew I had made a difference. I had been there for him, every step of the way. But now, it felt as though all of that was meaningless. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't let him get away with treating me this way, with assuming that my love and sacrifice could be reduced to a dollar amount. It wasn't about the wedding, or the money, or the bill. It was about his failure to recognize what truly mattered. It was about the way he had forgotten the values I had tried so hard to teach him. I knew I couldn't just confront him directly. Not yet. That would only push him further away, make him defensive, make him shut me out even more. No, I had to be strategic. I had to make him see the consequences of his actions without attacking him, without anger clouding my judgment. And so, I began to think. I began to plan. I would not let Ethan think he could manipulate me. I think he could simply demand money without consequence. I would show him the reality of the situation, the reality of his choices. I would make him see that there were consequences to his actions, that love and respect weren't things that could be taken for granted. I began to strategize, to figure out how I could make him understand without directly confronting him. I would gather information, document his behavior, and make sure that he saw the full extent of what he had done. I would make him understand that this was not just about money, it was about the way he had treated me, the way he had neglected the very people who had sacrificed everything for him. I stood up, my resolve hardening. The house, once filled with memories of Rachel and Ethan, felt different now. It felt empty, hollow, as though the love that had once filled these walls had been drained away. But I knew I couldn't let that stop me. I had a responsibility to myself, to the father I had been, and to the man I had raised. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about me. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect, and ensuring that the lessons I had tried to teach him wouldn't be forgotten. I couldn't undo the years of sacrifice, the years of love, but I could ensure that they weren't erased entirely, that they weren't treated as if they had meant nothing. I began to prepare. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. I was ready to show Ethan that there were consequences to his assumptions, to his entitled attitude. I was ready to remind him of what truly mattered. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship, a chapter where I would no longer be silent, where I would no longer be dismissed as just a source of money. It was time for him to learn, and it was time for me to take control of the narrative. I took one last look around the kitchen, at the table where we had shared so many moments, so many conversations, and I knew, deep down, that no matter what happened next, I had made the right decision. It was time to face the truth, and to make Ethan face it. After the realization had set in, after the dust had settled from the emotional storm triggered by the bill Ethan sent, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't allow myself to be passive anymore. The anger, while raw and genuine, was no longer the driving force. It was the steady pulse of resolve, the kind of inner strength that emerged when you realized you had been wronged and knew you had to act, not out of vengeance, but for your own dignity. The days that followed the bill were marked by a quiet determination, a plan forming in the recesses of my mind. I had come to a stark conclusion: Ethan needed to understand the weight of his actions and the consequences that came with them. But it wasn't going to be a confrontation of words. This was going to be different. I had spent so many years trying to provide him with the best, giving him every opportunity, every bit of love and sacrifice I had in me, and all I received in return was this cold, calculated demand. Ethan, my son, had decided that I was just another resource to be tapped into, just another check to be written. That wasn't the father I had been, and that certainly wasn't the father I was going to be moving forward. No longer was I the one who would simply give without questioning, without making sure he understood the true cost of what I had given him over the years. As I thought through everything, I realized I needed to approach this strategically. This wasn't just about showing Ethan the financial consequences of his actions. This was about teaching him the deeper lesson of respect, of understanding what it meant to truly appreciate the sacrifices that had been made for him. And, as much as it pained me to admit, this also had to be about letting go of the image of the perfect father I had held on to for so long. That ideal father, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose love was never questioned, had been shattered by Ethan's request. Now, it was time to confront reality. Not just for him, but for me as well. I couldn't help but think of the years we had spent together, the way Ethan had clung to me in his younger years. The moments when he would come to me for comfort, for guidance. But somewhere along the way, he had grown distant. He had found a new life. One that was far removed from the struggles we had faced together. And in doing so, he had forgotten the value of what had been given to him. I had become a distant figure in his life, someone he only turned to when it was convenient, someone who no longer had a place in the carefully constructed world he had built for himself. That was when it hit me. This was no longer just about my relationship with Ethan. It was about his own growth, his own understanding of what it meant to be responsible. I had given him everything I had, and now it was time for him to step up and recognize the toll it had taken. The sacrifices that had been made. I wasn't just his father anymore. I was someone who deserved respect, who deserved to be acknowledged, not for the material things I could provide, but for the love and effort I had poured into his life. I sat there, the weight of my decision settling over me like a fog. What had once been a quiet, unspoken hope, a hope that one day Ethan would come to understand the gravity of what I had done for him, had shifted into something more tangible. It was no longer about waiting for him to come around. It was about taking control of the situation, about guiding him toward the lesson he needed to learn. I had begun to formulate a plan. It wasn't going to be immediate, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be necessary. The way forward was through observation, through documenting the consequences of his actions, the cracks in the facade of his perfect life. He had taken so much for granted, assuming that everything would simply fall into place, that I would always be there to clean up the mess. But now, I was stepping back. I was giving him the space to see what would happen when the reality of his choices hit him. I reached for my phone and began organizing my thoughts. Alex Bennett, an old friend of Ethan's, had always been reliable, sharp, and observant. I hadn't reached out to him in years, but now, it seemed like the time. I couldn't let Ethan off the hook without seeing firsthand how his life had come to rely on others, on me, on the vendors, on the elaborate plans he had created without fully understanding the consequences. Alex had always been good at reading people, at understanding the nuances in a situation that others might miss. He was the perfect person to help me monitor Ethan's wedding and gather the information I needed to show him the reality of his actions. As I composed the message to Alex, I thought about the role he would play in this. I wasn't asking him to intervene directly or to get involved in any way that would disrupt the event itself. No, I needed him to observe, to gather details, to capture the subtle moments that Ethan and Sophia might overlook. I needed to know how reliant they were on external factors, on my contribution, on the vendors they had handpicked. I needed to see the wedding unraveling, not through the lens of anger or resentment, but through the lens of accountability. I hit send on the message to Alex, feeling a strange sense of anticipation rise within me. This wasn't going to be easy. It was going to require patience and a level of emotional detachment that I hadn't had to embrace in years. But as I stared at my phone, I realized that this was the first step in a new kind of relationship with my son. It was no longer about giving endlessly, no longer about being the perfect father who would always provide, always support. This was about setting boundaries, about ensuring that Ethan understood the value of the sacrifices I had made for him, and about teaching him the importance of accountability. The rest of the day passed slowly, each hour weighed down by the thoughts swirling in my mind. What would Ethan think when he realized that I wasn't just going to hand over the money he expected? What would he do when he saw that I was no longer the person he could manipulate into compliance? I couldn't predict the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't back down. This was my moment to show Ethan that the things he took for granted, my support, my love, my sacrifice, were not guaranteed. They were earned, and they could be lost if not properly valued. The next day, Alex responded to my message. He was on board. We had a plan in place. As the wedding day drew closer, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The storm of anger had passed, and in its place was a quiet, focused determination. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about Ethan. It was about helping him grow, about making him face the consequences of his actions in a way that words alone couldn't convey. And I was ready for whatever came next. As I sat back in my chair, thinking through the plan, I couldn't help but reflect on the years I had spent raising Ethan. I had always believed that he would come to appreciate everything I had done for him. But now, as the pieces of this plan began to fall into place, I realized that appreciation wasn't something I could demand. It was something that had to be earned. And in this moment, Ethan was going to learn that lesson, whether he liked it or not. As the days passed, I found myself staring at my phone more than I ever had in the past. The anticipation that had built up in me was both familiar and unsettling. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. Every step I had taken in the days leading up to Ethan's wedding had been calculated, deliberate. I had set my boundaries, reached out to Alex, and organized the groundwork. Now, all I had to do was wait for the pieces to fall into place. And as I waited, I couldn't help but reflect on how we had come to this point. It had started so simply, with a flicker of hope, a hope that Ethan might finally see the value of what I had done for him, that he might recognize the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, and the relentless effort I had put into raising him. That hope had now turned into something more tangible, a plan I had watched too long from the sidelines, as my son built a life that seemed to forget everything I had worked for. He had become someone who no longer saw me as a father, but as a tool, a resource to be tapped into when it was convenient. And I had let it happen. But no more. I couldn't quite explain what had changed in me. Maybe it was the realization that I had given everything, only to be discarded like an old pair of shoes when I was no longer useful. Maybe it was the bill, the simple yet cold piece of paper that had shattered the illusion of our relationship, forcing me to see things as they really were. Ethan was no longer the boy who used to look up to me, the boy who used to need me. He had grown into someone I didn't recognize, someone whose priorities and sense of entitlement had taken precedence over everything I had taught him. As I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee and staring at the screen, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over me. The storm of anger that had surged through me when I first read that bill had long since passed. It had been replaced by something quieter, something more strategic. I had spent years trying to be the father Ethan wanted, the father I thought he needed. Now, I was going to be the father who made sure he understood the value of respect and accountability. I was going to teach him not through confrontation, but through action. Alex had been the key to making this happen. He had always been observant, someone who noticed the things others missed. He knew Ethan better than anyone, and that was why I had turned to him. Alex had agreed to help, and now, as the wedding day approached, I knew that everything was set in motion. He would be the eyes and ears on the ground, documenting everything, every interaction, every mistake, every moment that would reveal the cracks in Ethan and Sophia's perfect world. I had no intention of confronting Ethan directly. That would have been too easy, too immediate. No, this was about letting him face the reality of his own choices. The wedding, which had been so carefully planned, that was about to unravel in ways neither he nor Sophia could have predicted. Every vendor, every caterer, every florist, they were all part of the delicate web that had been woven around their carefully curated image. And now, that web was beginning to fray. The first update from Alex came early in the morning. Just as the wedding preparations were beginning, the weather had turned sour, the skies gray and heavy with rain. It was the perfect metaphor for the situation. The wedding, which had been polished to perfection in photographs and social media posts, was about to encounter the harshness of reality. Alex's first photos showed the vendors struggling to set up in the rain, the floral arrangements beginning to wilt in the moisture, and the catering staff looking frazzled as they tried to adjust to last-minute changes. Each message that came through painted a picture of chaos just beneath the surface. The grand venue, the chateau in Montreal, looked magnificent, of course, but the cracks were starting to show. The food deliveries were delayed. The floral arrangements were falling behind schedule, and the photographer was already behind on their timeline. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, not because I was enjoying their misery, but because I knew that Ethan was about to learn a lesson. He had assumed everything would fall into place because it always had. But life didn't work that way. By mid-morning, the situation had already escalated. Alex's updates became more frequent, and the photos more revealing. The wedding planner was running around like a headless chicken, trying to pull everything together at the last minute. There was panic in the air, the kind that only happens when a perfect plan starts to crumble. The band had arrived late. The catering was scrambling to set up in time, and the photographer was struggling to keep up with the schedule. Each problem compounded the next, creating a sense of disarray that no amount of money could fix. I sat back in my chair, letting the information sink in. This was exactly what I had hoped for. Not the chaos itself, but the natural consequences of Ethan's assumptions. He had thought that money could fix everything, that the perfect wedding could be bought, that the perfect life could be bought. But as the wedding started to unravel, the cracks in his worldview were becoming undeniable. He had built his life on the idea that appearances mattered more than anything else, that wealth and status were the keys to happiness. But now, as he watched his wedding day fall apart, he was about to learn that those things were fleeting. As the day wore on, the problems continued to pile up. Alex sent more photo-stressed staff, delayed deliveries, anxious vendors, and I felt a strange satisfaction as I observed the unraveling of Ethan's perfect day. The carefully crafted narrative they had worked so hard to build was beginning to collapse under its own weight. I wasn't doing anything to make it happen. I was simply watching, documenting, and letting the natural consequences take their course. I knew that Ethan would be furious when he realized what was happening. He would be angry, frustrated, and confused. But this was exactly what he needed. He had spent too long living in a world where he thought he could control everything, where he believed that money and status were the answers to every problem. But the truth was that life wasn't perfect, and neither was he. And this wedding, which had been the ultimate expression of his expectations, who was about to show him just how fragile his world really was. By the time evening rolled around, the wedding had descended into full-blown chaos. The caterers were threatening to leave, the band was late, and the photographer was struggling to keep up with the schedule. Guests were arriving, but there was no sign of the carefully orchestrated ceremony they had been promised. The tension was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm satisfaction. This was the moment of reckoning. Ethan was about to realize that his expectations were out of touch with reality. As the day drew to a close, I received the phone call I had been expecting. Ethan's voice was frantic, "Despérate," and filled with a sense of urgency. "Dad, you have to help. Everything's falling apart. We need you to send the money. Now." I let the silence hang between us for a moment before responding. "Ethan, this isn't about money anymore. This is about accountability. You've built your life on assumptions that I would always be there to clean up your mess. But you're learning today that life doesn't work that way." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him trying to process what I was saying, trying to understand why I wasn't helping him fix the mess he had created. But I wasn't going to be the one to save him anymore. This was his lesson to learn, and I was going to make sure he learned it. The phone call ended, and I sat there, staring at my phone, a strange sense of calm washing over me. The consequences were unfolding exactly as I had hoped. Ethan had been forced to confront the reality of his own actions, to realize that his world of privilege and perfection was built on fragile assumptions, and I had done nothing to make it happen but stand back and watch. The next few days were a whirlwind of updates from Alex and messages from Ethan, each one more frantic than the last, but I didn't rush to answer his calls, didn't rush to fix things. I let him stew in the consequences of his actions. It was time for him to learn the value of accountability, and when he finally came to me, when he finally understood the lesson I had been trying to teach him, I knew that our relationship would be different. It would no longer be built on the assumption that I would always give, always provide. It would be built on respect, understanding, and the recognition that actions have consequences. As I sat in my quiet kitchen, I realized that this wasn't just about Ethan. It was about me, too. I had spent so many years giving, so many years sacrificing, without ever truly expecting anything in return. But now, I understood that my love and my efforts deserved respect, and I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all my own son, take that for granted again. The lesson was far from over, but it had begun. As the days passed, I watched from the sidelines as the aftermath of Ethan's wedding slowly unfolded. It wasn't the grand spectacle I had imagined, nor was it the perfect event he had hoped for. No, what I witnessed was a slowly crumbling facade, held together by fragility and fleeting attempts at perfection. The cracks, which had been so carefully hidden under layers of social media posts and carefully curated images, were now exposed. I had seen the reality behind the polished images, the hurried apologies, the desperate calls. But in all of it, I knew that Ethan was beginning to see the world as it truly was, a place where actions, no matter how well disguised, eventually catch up with you. It had been 3 days since the wedding, and the phone calls had come, but I hadn't responded immediately. I wanted him to stew, to really think about what he had done and how he had tried to manipulate me into stepping in and fixing everything. He had, in his mind, expected me to comply, to be the constant backup he always had. But I couldn't be that man anymore. I wouldn't be. The message from Alex was the final push. He sent me an update late in the evening. His words, a mixture of weariness and satisfaction. The chaos of the wedding had escalated to the point where guests were leaving early. Vendors were becoming increasingly frustrated, and the promised perfect day was a far cry from the reality unfolding before Ethan. It was a disaster. But it wasn't just a disaster for the wedding. It was a personal reckoning for Ethan. It was the moment of truth. The moment where he could no longer deny the consequences of his entitlement. As Alex's last message came through, I felt the sense of satisfaction I had been waiting for. Not because I was vindictive, but because Ethan was finally experiencing the consequences of his actions. He had lived for so long in a bubble, surrounded by privilege and expectations, thinking that money could fix everything, but life had shown him otherwise. The wedding wasn't the dream he had thought it would be. It was a reflection of the fragile foundation on which it had been built. Ethan called me again the next morning. His voice was softer this time. Lacking the urgency that had marked his earlier calls, there was a hesitation in it, an uncertainty that I hadn't heard before. I almost didn't want to answer. Part of me wanted to continue holding the line, to let him come to terms with everything, but I knew this moment couldn't be avoided any longer. It had to happen. Dad, he began, the words slow, careful. I know I've messed up. I know I've taken you for granted. And I've been wrong. I don't know what to say. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the past few days settling in my chest. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the confrontation, the acknowledgement. But it wasn't about me. It wasn't about the hurt I had felt, or the years of sacrifice I had given. This was about Ethan. This was his lesson to learn. I'm listening. Ethan, I said, my voice calm, controlled. But you need to understand something. I've spent my whole life providing for you, supporting you, loving you, and I never expected anything in return. But I also didn't expect to be treated like a tool, a resource to be tapped into when it was convenient. You've always assumed that I would always be here, always ready to fix things for you. But that's not reality. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, the weight of my words sinking in. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was just tired of being overlooked, tired of giving without ever being seen. I don't want your pity, Ethan, I continued, and I don't need you to feel guilty. What I need is for you to understand what's happened here. This wedding, all this chaos, it's not just about the money. It's about the fact that you thought you could control everything, that you could expect people to fall in line with your plans. But life doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. I understand that now, he replied, his voice small. I never thought about it like that. I never realized how much I had taken for granted. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. I had hoped for this moment, but it felt different now. It wasn't as satisfying as I had imagined. The truth was, I didn't want him to feel ashamed. I wanted him to feel enlightened, to understand what had led us here and what needed to change. But that would take time. I couldn't fix this overnight. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready to fully understand it yet. You've made mistakes. Ethan, I said, the words deliberate, but you're not beyond redemption. I've always believed in you. That's why I kept fighting for you. Kept hoping. But you need to understand that the way you've been living, believing that everything will just fall into place, doesn't work. People are not going to bend to your will just because you have the resources. Respect, understanding, humility, those are things that money can't buy. Another long pause followed. It felt like a lifetime, and then he spoke again. But this time, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Genuine contrition. I'm sorry. Dad, I've been selfish, and I've taken you for granted. I I never realized how much you sacrificed for me. I just wanted everything to be perfect. But I didn't stop to think about what really mattered. I should have been there for you too. I should have appreciated everything you did for me. I'll do better. I promise. There it was, the words I had been waiting for. And yet, as I listened to him, I felt a strange mixture of relief and resignation. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. This wasn't a simple apology, it was a beginning. A beginning of something new, something that might take years to rebuild. But it had to start somewhere. I hope you do. Ethan, I said quietly, but it's going to take more than words. It's going to take actions. And that starts with understanding that you don't control everything. Life is messy. Relationships are messy, but they're real. And they deserve your respect. I get that, he replied, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. And I'll work on it. I promise. Thank you for being patient with me. I'll make things right. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a magic moment where everything was resolved. But for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't about the wedding, or the money, or the mistakes. It was about Ethan finally seeing the bigger picture, seeing me as more than just a provider, more than just someone who was there when things went wrong. It was about him understanding that he had a responsibility to the people in his life, to the ones who had always had his back, and to the love that had never asked for anything in return. As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me. I had spent so long holding on to anger, frustration, and regret. But now, it was time to let go of that. It was time for both of us to move forward. I couldn't force Ethan to change, but I could hope that he would. I could hope that this was the turning point he needed to stop taking people for granted and start living with a sense of gratitude. It wasn't the perfect ending to the story I had imagined. But then again, life had never been about perfection. It had always been about growth, learning from mistakes, and moving forward. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, Ethan was ready to start doing just that. The phone call ended, and for a moment, I sat in silence, letting the weight of the conversation settle around me. I hadn't expected a miracle, nor had I anticipated an immediate transformation. But there was something in Ethan's voice of vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. It was a glimmer of the boy I had raised, the one who had once looked up to me. And for a brief second, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps things could change. Perhaps this was the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on the conversation over and over. There were moments when I doubted whether Ethan truly understood the gravity of his actions. Moments when I wondered if his apology had been nothing more than words, a response to his immediate discomfort, rather than a genuine desire for change. But then, there were other moments when I saw the sincerity in his actions. Slowly but surely, he began to reach out more. Not just with apologies, but with effort to reconnect, to make amends, and to show me that he was trying to be the person I had always hoped he would become. It wasn't easy, though change never is. But it was happening, piece by piece, day by day. Ethan, for the first time in a long time, was beginning to realize that life wasn't just about getting what he wanted. It was about understanding the cost of his desires and acknowledging the people who had been there for him all along. It was about realizing that money, status, and perfection didn't define who he was, or who he could become. The real measure of a man was in his ability to be humble, to appreciate the sacrifices others made for him, and to act with integrity. The process of reconciliation was slow, like a river carving its way through rock. There were setbacks, moments when I questioned if we were making progress. But I refused to give up. Ethan, too, seemed to realize that this journey required more than just words. It required actions. He began to show up, not just for me, but for others, demonstrating a willingness to give, to be present, and to make things right. The bill for his wedding was no longer the elephant in the room. Instead, it became a symbol of his growth, a reminder of the distance he had come, and the distance he still needed to travel. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a shift in our relationship. The walls that had once existed between us began to crumble, not with one grand gesture, but through small, consistent moments. He started taking responsibility, not just for his actions, but for his relationships, his relationship with me, with Sophia, and with the family that had always supported him. His first step was an unexpected one, a letter. It arrived one morning, sitting on my kitchen table, a simple envelope with my name written in familiar handwriting. I opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, I found a letter, not just a note of apology, but a heartfelt reflection on his journey, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the promises he intended to keep. I could tell this wasn't just an apology written out of obligation. This was his attempt to articulate the growth he had experienced. As I read, I couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. This was the son I had raised, a son who was finally starting to understand the value of accountability. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete. There were still moments of frustration, still moments when I felt the old patterns creep back in. But I had to remind myself that change, real change, takes time. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was on the right path. The letter concluded with a simple sentence that stuck with me. Dad, I'm learning, and I'm trying. I hope we can rebuild what was lost. In that moment, I realized that maybe this wasn't the end of our story, but rather a new beginning, a chance for both of us to grow, to learn, and to rebuild our bond on a foundation of mutual respect, humility, and understanding. The months that followed were full of small but meaningful moments. Ethan took steps to make things right, not just with me, but with everyone he had hurt. He started showing up at family events, spending more time with people who had been pushed away, reconnecting with old friends, and trying to repair relationships that had been neglected. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard. But the effort was there, and that effort spoke volumes. I, too, had to adjust. I had to learn how to let go of the bitterness and resentment that had built up over the years. It wasn't easy. There were times when the old wounds resurfaced, times when I felt the sting of betrayal all over again. But I reminded myself that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting it, was about letting go of the past in order to embrace the future. And while it was still a work in progress, I knew that I was learning just as much as Ethan. We were both on a journey of healing, of rediscovery, and of rebuilding something that had once seemed irreparably broken. Through it all, I began to see the subtle changes in Ethan. He was no longer the entitled young man who had taken everything for granted. He was starting to understand what it meant to be responsible, to be a man of integrity, and to take ownership of his actions. It wasn't just about making amends for the past. It was about building a future that was rooted in respect and understanding. And then, one day, he asked me if I would come to visit him and Sophia in Toronto. It was a simple request, one that had once felt impossible. But now it felt like a natural step forward. I agreed. And a few weeks later, I found myself on a plane, heading to the city where Ethan had built his life with Sophia. The visit was everything I had hoped it would be and more halbe. There were no grand gestures, no perfect moments. Just a quiet afternoon spent with my son and his fiancée, catching up on the years that had passed. We talked about everything the past, the present, and the future, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on equal footing, like we were truly seeing each other for who we were, not just father and son, but two people trying to navigate the complexities of life and relationships. That visit, that simple afternoon, was the moment I realized how far we had come. The distance between us had not only been bridged by time, but by effort, understanding, and a shared commitment to growth. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a step in the right direction. As I boarded the plane home, I reflected on everything that had happened. The anger, the disappointment, the heartache. It had all been necessary for this moment of reconciliation, and while there was still work to be done, I knew that we were finally moving in the right direction. Ethan had learned a valuable lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But I had learned something, too, the power of patience, the importance of setting boundaries, and the incredible value of second chances. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, not just for Ethan and me, but for all the relationships in my life. The lesson was clear. Growth and healing take time, but with effort, understanding, and a willingness to change, even the deepest wounds can be healed. As the plane touched down, I smiled to myself, knowing that the road ahead, while still uncertain, was filled with the promise of possibility. The future was no longer a place defined by the mistakes of the past, but a place where we could finally begin again. The visit to Toronto had been the pivotal moment I'd longed for, the turning of a page in a story that had been stuck in a loop of anger, disappointment, and distance. As I made my way back home, I couldn't help but replay the events in my mind, every conversation, every gesture, and the quiet moments where it felt like the years of emotional disconnection had been bridged by something as simple as shared presence. Sitting on the plane, I thought about how much Ethan had changed. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was something far more significant. He was finally beginning to understand what I had always tried to teach him: the value of responsibility, the importance of humility, and, above all, the need for genuine connection. And while it wasn't perfect, it was progress. And that was enough. The man sitting across from me on that plane wasn't the same person who had sent me a bill for his wedding. This Ethan was one who had taken the first step toward understanding the consequences of his actions. And that gave me hope. I arrived back in Ottawa with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The trip had been cathartic. Not because everything had been fixed, but because it had been the first real opportunity for us to reconnect. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about creating a new space between us. One where we could both move forward without the burden of unresolved tension hanging over us. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like we were on the same path, moving toward healing together. The next few weeks were quieter, more reflective. Ethan and I exchanged messages regularly, but it wasn't as if there were grand declarations or profound apologies every time. It was the little things, the way he would check in with me, the casual references to how he was working on certain areas of his life, and how he'd taken steps to be more present for those around him. I could tell that his growth was genuine, even if it was slow. He was becoming more attuned to his actions, realizing that every choice he made impacted not just him, but the people who cared about him. The realization hadn't come easily, but it was coming, and that mattered. Sophia, too, had been more open during our time together in Toronto. It wasn't just Ethan who was changing. There was a quiet shift in their dynamic as a couple. I could see how she was learning to navigate her own expectations, understanding that their relationship needed more than just material wealth or social validation to thrive. It was a delicate balance, one they were still figuring out, but there was a sense of mutual respect between them that hadn't been there before. It gave me hope for the future for both of them. Despite this sense of peace settling into my life, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The anger I had felt toward Ethan, the betrayal I had experienced, and the sense of isolation I had lived with for so long, it all felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a quiet understanding that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about moving forward, letting go of past hurts, and allowing ourselves the space to grow. As the weeks passed, Ethan and I continued to strengthen our bond, but I could sense there was still some work to do. Our relationship, though improving, wasn't entirely free of the scars of the past. I still felt the weight of the years we'd spent apart, the silence that had followed Rachel's death, and the resentment that had built up between us over time. It wasn't something that would vanish overnight, no matter how much progress we made. But for the first time in years, I felt like there was a possibility for genuine reconciliation. One afternoon, about a month after my trip to Toronto, Ethan called me. It wasn't a scheduled call, and I could tell by the tone of his voice that he was hesitant. I picked up the phone, feeling a surge of both anticipation and uncertainty. Was this another apology? Was there more he needed to say? Or had something happened that would require us to confront the past once again? "Hey, Dad," Ethan began, his voice a little shaky. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. About how things have been, and I wanted to ask if you could come visit again soon. There's something I need to show you. Something important." I paused, taken aback. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I could feel the gravity of the moment. "What's going on?" "Ethan," I asked, carefully. He took a deep breath before responding. "I've been doing a lot of work on myself, a lot of self-reflection, and I want you to see it, to see how much I've changed. I want to show you that I'm really trying. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm serious about making things right. Please, Dad, I need you to see that." There was a sincerity in his voice that I hadn't heard in years, and for the first time, I felt like the son I had known was returning. It wasn't a perfect return, but it was a return nonetheless, and that was enough. "I'll come," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "I'll come when you're ready. I want to see what you've done. Ethan, I want to see where we're headed." We hung up after setting a date for the visit, and I sat there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. It was as though a new chapter was beginning one that was still uncertain. Still fragile, but one that held the promise of growth and understanding. I wasn't sure what exactly Ethan had to show me, but I trusted him enough to give him the opportunity to prove it. The next few days were filled with anticipation. I prepared for the visit, unsure of what I might encounter. Would Ethan have changed so much that I wouldn't recognize him, or would we still be bound by the same old patterns? It was hard to say, but I knew that whatever happened, it would be an important moment for both of us. We had come so far, but there was still more to be done. When I arrived in Toronto, Ethan met me at the door, a wide smile on his face. There was a warmth in his eyes, but it wasn't the confident, assured gaze I'd seen in the past. This time, there was something softer, something more vulnerable. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I looked at him, recognizing the person he had become. "Dad, I'm really glad you're here," he said, pulling me into a hug. "I've got something I need to show you." We spent the next few hours talking, catching up on everything that had been going on in our lives. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't forced. There was a natural flow to the conversation, something that had been missing for so long. I could feel the years of tension start to melt away, replaced by a sense of ease that we hadn't experienced in ages. Finally, Ethan led me to a small room in the back of his apartment. It wasn't much, just a simple space, filled with bookshelves and old photographs, but the significance of it hit me immediately. On the walls were pictures of Rachel and me, photos from when Ethan was a child. There were images of family vacations, holidays, and moments of laughter memories that I hadn't seen in years. But the most striking thing was the collection of framed notes and letters that lined the walls. Each one was a letter Ethan had written to me over the years, letters that he had kept but never sent. "I've been keeping these for a long time," Ethan said quietly. "I never knew how to say these things to you. I was too proud, too caught up in my own world. But I want you to read them now." I felt a lump in my throat as I looked at the letters. Each one a small testament to Ethan's growth. He had written about his regrets, his struggles, and the ways in which he had failed me. But more than that, he had written about his hope for the future, his desire to rebuild our relationship and to learn from the mistakes of the past. I took a deep breath and began to read, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. As I read each letter, I could feel the weight of the years lifting. I could feel the distance between us shrinking, replaced by something much more profound, a shared understanding, a mutual desire to heal, and a commitment to rebuild what had been broken. When I finished, I looked up at Ethan, tears in my eyes. "This is more than I could have hoped for," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far, son, and I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled, his own eyes misty. "I'm proud of us, too, Dad, and I'm ready to keep moving forward." As I left Toronto that day, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The journey wasn't over, but it had taken an important step toward healing, and for the first time in a long time. I believed that redemption, forgiveness, and a new beginning were not just possibilities, they were real. The past was no longer a burden. It was a lesson that had shaped us. And now, it was time to move forward, together. The days after my visit to Toronto were filled with a quiet but profound sense of change. It wasn't the kind of change you could pinpoint with a single event or a dramatic conversation. It was the subtle shift of two people who, after years of silence and distance, had started to find their way back to one another. The letters Ethan had written, the conversations we had shared, and the space we had given each other to heal, these were the building blocks of a new chapter. As I sat back in my home in Ottawa, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed in such a short amount of time. It felt like I had been walking a solitary path for so long, carrying the weight of my regrets, my sacrifices, and the silent heartache of a father who had been pushed away. But now, as I looked ahead, I felt something that had eluded me for years, hope. Hope that the relationship I thought had been lost forever could be mended. Slowly but surely, Ethan's growth, though still in its early stages, was undeniable. I had seen the change in his eyes, heard it in his voice. The young man who once saw me as a mere provider had begun to see me as a father again. He was starting to understand what it meant to appreciate the sacrifices I had made, not just as a father, but as a person who had done everything within his power to give him the best life possible. That understanding wasn't immediate, and it wouldn't be easy, but I could see the potential for real connection between us, and that was enough for me. I had to remind myself that healing wasn't an overnight process. The wounds were deep, and the scars would always be there. But I had begun to believe that they didn't have to define us. Ethan and I had both been through so much loss, disappointment, and disconnection, but it felt like we were now standing at the edge of something new. A new beginning. If we both were willing to put in the effort to rebuild, the phone calls between us continued. Though they weren't always frequent, there were moments of awkwardness, where neither of us quite knew what to say, and moments of silence that I tried not to overthink. But there were also moments of warmth, of laughter, of shared memories that felt less like ghosts and more like present-day connections. We were still learning how to be in each other's lives. But the effort was there. One day, about a month after my visit, I received a message from Ethan. It was short, almost casual, but there was something in it that caught my attention. "Hey, Dad, I've been thinking about how much I've missed out on. I want to do something for you. Let me know if you're free next weekend. I have a plan." I stared at the message for a long moment, my finger hovering over the keyboard as I tried to figure out how to respond. Was this just another one of his attempts at making things right, or was this something more significant? I didn't know. But I couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. Whatever it was, Ethan was taking initiative, and that was a step forward. The weekend came, and with it, Ethan's invitation. He asked me to meet him at a small, local cafe in Ottawa, a place I had passed by countless times but had never actually entered. When I walked in, I immediately spotted him sitting at a table near the window, his back slightly hunched, as if unsure of himself. He stood when he saw me, giving me a nervous smile. "Hey, Dad," he greeted me, his voice soft but sincere. "Hey, Ethan," I replied, returning the smile. "You doing okay?" He nodded, but there was a nervousness to him that I hadn't seen before. He motioned for me to sit down, and I did, taking in the surroundings. The cafe was cozy, warm, and inviting, nothing like the coldness that had existed between us for so long. "I know we've had a lot of talks lately," he began, picking up his cup of coffee and swirling it absent-mindedly. "But I don't think I've ever really shown you, you know, how much I appreciate everything you've done, and how much I regret all the time we've lost." I felt a knot form in my throat, hearing him say those words, after everything we had been through, was more than I had expected. It was like a weight had been lifted, but there was still so much left to process. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realized that I haven't given you a chance to really see me change," he continued, his voice steady now. "So, I wanted to do something that would show you how much I care." I watched him carefully, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. He seemed different, more grounded, like someone who had finally recognized the importance of those connections that had once felt so distant. "I've been working on a project," he said, his eyes lighting up slightly. "It's something I've been wanting to do for a while. I want to take you on a trip, a small one, just the two of us. No big plans, no fancy hotels, just time together, away from everything else." The offer took me by surprise. "A trip, just the two of us. I've already got the tickets," he said, pulling out 2 boarding passes from his bag and sliding them across the table. To me, "I thought we could go to the cabin by the lake, remember? It's been years since we've been there." The cabin. My mind immediately flashed back to summers spent there with Rachel and Ethan, fishing, hiking, and cooking meals together. It had been a place of happiness and simplicity, a place where we had been a family. I hadn't been back since Rachel's death. But the memories came flooding back with such clarity that I felt a rush of emotion. I looked at Ethan, taking in his face, the one I hadn't seen clearly in so long. This wasn't just an offer to make up for the past. It was a genuine desire to reconnect, to heal, to do the work that we had both been avoiding. Ethan, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. This means a lot, more than you know. He smiled, his shoulders relaxing. I just want to show you that I'm trying. Dad, I want to make it right. We spent the next few hours planning the trip, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. And by the time we left the cafe, I felt like we had taken another important step toward rebuilding what had been lost. As I walked back to my car, the boarding pass is still in my pocket. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Ethan's gesture, simple yet meaningful, was the culmination of everything we had worked through, the culmination of years of frustration, anger, and confusion. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were finally on the same page, moving forward together, one step at a time. The trip to the cabin would be the next chapter in our journey. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would be another opportunity for us to heal, to reconnect, and to make new memories together. This wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a new one. A story of forgiveness, of understanding, and, most importantly, of love. I didn't know what the future held for us. But in that moment, I felt hopeful. For the first time in years, I believed that we could build something stronger, something real, and something lasting. And that was enough for me. The trip to the cabin felt like a bridge connecting two parts of our lives, the past, full of memories that had been buried under years of silence and misunderstandings, and the present, where Ethan and I were trying to rediscover the bond that once made us family. As we drove north, the roads became less familiar, the cityscape giving way to the gentle, rolling hills and thick trees that lined the highway. I could feel the weight of time lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a quiet anticipation. This was more than just a trip. It was a chance to heal, to share a part of our history that neither of us had dared revisit in so long. The cabin, tucked away by the lake, was a small, humble place, just the way I remembered it. The wooden exterior, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, stood as a testament to the countless summers spent here, years before life became so complicated. The lake was as serene as ever, its glassy surface reflecting the soft sky above. As we pulled into the familiar gravel driveway, I felt an overwhelming wave of nostalgia wash over me. This was where we had once laughed, worked, and simply existed together as a family. It felt like a different world from the one we had come to know in recent years, where the distance between us seemed insurmountable. Ethan and I unloaded the car in silence, both of us taking in the surroundings. I could tell that he was nervous, unsure of what to expect, just as I was. There was so much left unsaid between us, and yet there was this unspoken understanding that we both wanted something different now, something better. After we had settled in, we took a walk around the property. The path by the lake was overgrown, but it was still the same trail we had walked countless times before. When Ethan was a child, skipping stones across the water and laughing at his own clumsy attempts. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much I had missed those simpler days, the days before everything became so complicated, before Ethan became a stranger to me, before I became a figure in his life who was, at times, more of a burden than a father. I used to love this place, Ethan said quietly, his voice almost lost in the rustling of the trees. It's hard to believe we ever felt normal here. You know, that it wasn't all about what we didn't have. I nodded, my throat tight. I know. I remember the first time you tried to fish with me here. You were so excited when you finally caught one, even though it was the smallest fish I'd ever seen. Ethan chuckled, the sound light and nostalgic. I thought I was a pro back then. You were? I said, a smile tugging at my lips. We both were. We walked for a while longer, our conversation tentative, but gradually finding its rhythm. It wasn't easy, and at times it felt like we were walking on eggshells, afraid of saying the wrong thing or opening wounds that hadn't fully healed. But there was something in the air, something between us that made me believe we could navigate this, slowly, but surely. That evening, after we had settled into the cabin and shared a simple meal of grilled steaks and vegetables, nothing fancy, just like we used to, it felt as though the walls between us had started to come down, if only a little. We weren't talking about the past just yet, not the painful stuff, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. The cabin, in its quiet simplicity, seemed to offer us a space to just be together again. Later that night, after we had cleaned up, we sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The gentle hum of the lake was the only sound between us. I could feel the shift, the slow reawakening of a connection that had once been so strong. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of regret pressing down on me. I've been thinking a lot, Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence, about everything, about us. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. What about us? I don't know where it went wrong. Dad, he continued, his voice low and uncertain. I don't know why we stopped talking, why I pushed you away. I guess I wanted more. I wanted everything to be perfect. And when it wasn't, when things didn't go the way I thought they should, I didn't know how to handle it. So I just ignored you. His words hit me harder than I expected. The vulnerability in his voice, the realization that he had carried that weight with him all this time, it struck a chord deep within me. For years, I had blamed myself for the distance between us, thinking it was something I had done wrong. But here, with Ethan admitting his own mistakes, I realized that this was something we had both failed to see clearly. We had both been trapped in our own worlds, too proud, too hurt, to reach out to each other. I get it, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't think I was the perfect father. He made mistakes, too, but I always did what I thought was best for you, even when I couldn't give you everything you wanted, even when I failed. But what I didn't do was talk to you about it, and I'm sorry for that. Ethan nodded, his gaze focused on the lake. I know, Dad, and I'm sorry too. I never took the time to see things from your side. I always thought I had it harder, that you didn't understand. But I get it now. I know you were doing your best. He paused, his voice faltering slightly. I just wish I hadn't let it get this far. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it wasn't the end of the road, but it was the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long time, I felt like Ethan was finally seeing me, not just as the father who had let him down, but as a person with his own struggles, his own flaws, his own capacity for growth. And in return, I was beginning to see Ethan for who he was, now a young man who had learned hard lessons, and who was willing to admit his mistakes. We sat there in silence for a long time, each lost in our thoughts. But for the first time in years, The silence didn't feel heavy. It wasn't uncomfortable or filled with resentment. It was a quiet understanding, a shared sense of moving forward together. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it felt like we were on the right path. The next morning, after a peaceful night's sleep, we decided to spend the day exploring the nearby trails. It was a beautiful autumn day, crisp air, bright sunlight filtering through the trees, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our boots. We walked, talked, and laughed, slowly picking up where we had left off all those years ago. We talked about everything and nothing, old memories, new plans, the things that made us laugh, and the things that made us pause and reflect. By the time we returned to the cabin, I felt a deep sense of contentment I hadn't known in a long time. Ethan and I weren't where we wanted to be yet, but we were closer than we had been in years. We were taking the first steps towards something that felt like it could last. A father and son who had both made mistakes, but who were willing to put in the work to make it right. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that we could, the final step, healing and moving forward. As the days passed at the cabin, I began to notice something I hadn't expected, a sense of peace that slowly settled between Ethan and me. It wasn't just that the tension had eased or that we were able to speak more openly, though both of those things were certainly true. No, this peace was deeper, more profound. It was the kind of peace that came from confronting the past, from the painful but necessary conversations we had, and from realizing that perhaps we were both more willing to move forward than we had ever been before. By the time the weekend arrived, the crisp autumn air had turned colder, but it didn't feel like a cold I had to guard against. Instead, it felt like the kind of cold that comes after a storm has passed, refreshing, revitalizing, and full of possibility. Ethan and I had spent the past few days reconnecting, working through difficult emotions, and acknowledging the distance that had grown between us over the years. We had explored the trails, revisited old memories, and, most importantly, we had begun the process of forgiveness, not just of each other, but also of ourselves. That morning, as we sat down for breakfast at the small wooden table by the window, I noticed how much had changed in such a short time. Gone was the tension that used to hang between us like a heavy fog. Gone was the silence that had often filled the space where conversation once thrived. Now, there was a sense of ease, of familiarity, as if we were finding our way back to something we had both lost track of. "I'm glad we came here, Dad," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was different now, softer, more reflective. "It feels like we've been stuck in the same place for so long. And now, I don't know. It feels like we've made some kind of progress, like we're finally moving forward." I smiled, my heart swelling with emotion. "Me too, Ethan. I think we're both a little surprised by how much we needed this." He nodded, his gaze focused on his coffee mug. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about everything you said, the mistakes I made, the things I took for granted, and I know it's not going to be easy to fix everything, but I want to try. I really do." I reached across the table and placed my hand on his manip. "It's not going to be easy. No, but we've got time. We've got time to rebuild, to start over, to make things right." Ethan's eyes met mine then, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. It was the look of someone who had let go of their pride, someone who was no longer afraid to face the truth, no longer afraid to acknowledge the mistakes they had made. "I want to make it up to you, Dad," he said quietly. "I want to show you that I'm not that person I was before. I want to show you that I appreciate everything you've done for me, everything you've sacrificed. I've been so selfish, and I hate that. I squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to hate yourself. Ethan, you just have to recognize that the past doesn't define you. It's what you do with the present and the future that matters. For a moment, there was silence again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was a comfortable silence. A moment of understanding between us. The weight of the years apart. The hurt. And the misunderstandings seemed to dissipate with each passing second, replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of two people beginning to rebuild their connection. Later that day, we sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the trees, the orange and pink hues of the sky reflected in the stillness of the lake, creating a serene, almost magical atmosphere. Ethan had insisted on bringing a bottle of wine to share, something we hadn't done together in years. We clinked glasses, and for the first time, it felt like we were truly present with each other, not just as father and son, but as two people who had learned to understand one another again. I was thinking. Ethan began, his voice slow, as though weighing each word carefully, about how we got here, how I ended up feeling so disconnected from you. And I think I know now it wasn't just the things that happened between us. It was me. I let my own fears, my own doubts, and my own anger take over. And I shut you out because I didn't know how to deal with it. But now, I see that I was wrong. I see how much you've always been there for me. Even when I didn't deserve it, I let out a deep breath, feeling a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying begin to lift. Ethan, I never stopped loving you. I know I made mistakes too. And I'm not perfect, but I always tried to be there for you. I know that sometimes I didn't understand your needs, or I didn't show up the way you wanted me to, but I was always doing the best I could. I just wanted you to know that. Ethan looked out at the horizon, his gaze distant for a moment as he took it all in. I know, Dad, and I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner. I guess I was so caught up in my own stuff that I couldn't see past it, but I'm trying to change that now. You don't have to do it alone. Ethan, I said, my voice firm but gentle. We're in this together. You don't have to shoulder the weight of the past, all by yourself. We can figure it out, one step at a time. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, memories of childhood. The absurd moments that had once seemed so small, but now felt like treasures. It was as though we were rediscovering the rhythm of a relationship that had been lost to time. We didn't have all the answers, and we knew that the road ahead would be far from perfect. But there was a shared understanding now. We were both committed to healing, and to changing, and to finally stepping into a future where we could support each other in the ways we both needed. As the night settled in, we sat in comfortable silence, the stars above twinkling like the promise of something new. It was in that moment that I realized something profound. This wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about the willingness to try, to evolve, and to be present for each other, no matter what had come before. And there, in the quiet of the evening, I understood the true lesson of our journey. Healing is not a destination, but a process. It's not something that can be rushed, nor is it something that happens overnight. But as long as we're willing to step forward, even in the face of uncertainty, even when the past feels like a heavy burden, the possibility of change remains within our reach. I turned to Ethan, who was now looking up at the stars, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. Thank you for this, he said softly, for giving me a chance, for not giving up on me. I smiled, my heart full. There's nothing to thank me for. Ethan, we're family. We always will be. And with that, the final step in our journey had begun, not just toward forgiveness, but toward something more powerful understanding. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic resolutions. It comes from small, intentional steps, conversations that are difficult but necessary, moments of vulnerability that allow us to see each other not as the people we wish we were, but as we truly are. Healing is about recognizing the imperfections in ourselves and in others, and choosing to move forward, together, despite those flaws. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.